Hello, everybody. Thank you for stopping by. Welcome to the Stand Up Taller podcast with Neil Berliner and Al Martin. Take it away, guys.
Hey everybody, Al Martin here with our Christmas edition of the Stand Up Taller podcast. And it's going to be a great one. We have a great guest, one with such incredible background in comedy. It's going to be unbelievable. Neil, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we have a legendary guy here, a great friend, a friend to the entire industry. Everybody loves this guy. You can't, you talk about people in the business and everybody has somebody they can't stand, right? Well, nobody can't stand Eddie Brill. Everybody loves Eddie Brill. So it's a real pleasure to have him on. He's helped so many comedians. I mean, he does workshops. He's just a giver. Eddie Brill's a giver. He's given to me. I mean, he's given me so many tips and gigs from people, and just, I mean, you can't say enough about this guy. So maybe we should just get right into it, and not do our customary bullshit at the beginning. Unless you want to talk about the cold for a second. 150 million people with sub-zero temperatures in this country today, tomorrow. Jesus,
It's horrible. I mean, it's just so. Like I was saying to you earlier, I just don't like to travel this time of year. It's just too much. You're dealing with too much. I mean, I'm sure people have to get somewhere, but if you can avoid it, why deal with? One time last year I got canceled 4 times. And not ahead of time. 4 times got to the airport and they just cancel a flight. It's crazy.
Yeah, thousands and thousands of flights. 170 airports are affected by this, apparently.
Yeah,
I got canceled last week 3 times, but that was by my wife for sex. But that's another story. Anyway,
leave the funny to Eddie.
I won't do the comedy. It's clear that I won't be doing the comedy here. It's clear that I'm not going to be the one involved in comedy. Okay, all right, let's bring him on. What the hell? So Eddie,
hey,
first, got to start off by saying it's kind of a special series of gigs you're doing recently with a person very special to you. Why don't you tell our audience about who you've been playing with recently?
yeah, well, my son, and when he was 21, he's 35 now. He had moved to LA because he was always his dream to, he's an actor musician, and he went out to look to get a job at a place just to make some money at the beginning, and he went over to the Comedy Store and just checked on it, and Mitzi, just like she treated me really well, treated my son really well and got him a job there, and little by little he started doing stand up. And then he became really good at it. He's been really dedicated and traveling all over as a comic. And so the mixture of his acting work, because he's doing a lot of film and television, but he's become a terrific stand-up. I'm very proud of him. Of course, you're going to be prejudiced about your own kid or whatever, but I really think he's great. The thing that the parts that make me know he's great is friends of mine like Don Myrera and people like that I really respect and admire. They all know and say that my son's really a great comic. So he was living in LA with his wife, and they had a baby, which is exciting. Came grandpa a little over a year ago.
Eddie.
Yeah, which was funny because I was named after my grandpa Eddie.
Yeah.
And it's really nice. And so they wanted to move back east. They just like it better over here. And they moved up to Poughkeepsie to start off, buy a house. And he's done a few shows up there because he kind of grew up there. That's a whole other story. And so he asked me if I would work with him, and I said, oh, of course. And so little by little, if he gets a gig, he'll call me and say, you want to work with me? And I get a gig, I see if he wants to work with me, and work together a lot. And in fact, during the New York Comedy Festival, we got to do a show in a nice intimate venue in the East Village called Pangea. And we just really complement each other very well. And it's a nice combination of two, different generations of comedy. And he gets better and better, and he makes him work harder and harder, which is fantastic.
So now, do you see the genetics coming through? Do you see some of yourself, the style, the gestures, the material, anything? I'm sure you do see something of you in him. And what is that, if you do?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see the gestures and the facial expressions, and but he's his own person, and And that's the part that I will never get in the way of. I want him to, be his own man, and he's taken that to heart, and he really is doing everything he could do to be himself, which is really the key in comedy, is to be your most authentic self.
Exactly.
And he understands that. When I was early, when I was working at Letterman back in the day and booking comics, I would bring him with me on these auditions. And we'd usually audition 10 comedians a night in a show, whatever city we were in. And we discuss together what we found out about what we felt about each comedian at audition, were they right for this certain show. And we gave each other, we were very honest with each other, gave each other a nice education, and it's a phenomenal relationship. I love him like crazy, and I couldn't be more proud.
And it's also, as you say, it's great to get the outside validation from other professionals and the audiences. In other words, he doesn't need Eddie Brill to be his own man and be his own successful comedian.
And he has a different last name than I do, which I think is helpful to him.
Absolutely.
Because they don't go, oh, here's, Eddie Brill's son or something like that. Not that anyone would say it or that we should care, but I really like that he has his own deal. The interesting part of the story, which is actually an incredibly long story that I won't give all the details to, but it's a phenomenal part of the story, is I didn't know I had a son until he was just about 12. And he came into my life, and it took a little bit of time for us to be comfortable with each other, but not long. And we just hit it off and hit the ground running. So, it was a little bit of a shock.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it happened at age 12, because you probably got to pay for the bar mitzvah.
Yeah, there you go. See, well, yeah, it was that age. I never thought of that.
That's incredible, Eddie, that that your son actually punched through a lot of places like the Comedy Store and stuff like that without your last name. Where if he had your last name, it probably would have made his life easier. So that's really something to be proud of, that he accomplished all this not using, say the brand, your brand, that, you're pretty well known in the comedy. And I think you have a lot of connections going back to the Comedy Store in your history.
Yeah. Back in '86, I went to do Star Search, and I had auditions at the Improv and the Comedy Store, and I did my improv audition, and Mark Leno said, look, we really think you're funny, but you have to move here in order for us to use you. And I go, I'll keep that in mind for the future. But I was running a comedy club in New York, the Paper Moon, which was wildly successful, and I wasn't giving that up until I gave it up to Barry Katz, and it became the Boston Comedy Club. So that's how I started that whole deal back then. So the point is that it's kind of interesting to me how I was able to create a certain thing on my own. Went out to LA, like I said, 1986. Mitzi Shore saw me and said, I love you, and anytime you're out here, you can work the comedy club, the Comedy Store. So I chose the Comedy Store because it gave me the chance to go back and forth, run the club in New York, and come out to LA. Sam Kinison was one of the many people who lent a hand to me back then. John Mendoza, Robert Schimmel, Taylor Negron, on, Diane Ford, people who just, Monica Piper, people who just were very generous to me and made my transfer very easy in LA. And so it gave me a chance to go back and forth. Kinison eventually said, hey, you should move out here because this is where the work is, and I'll make sure you're working every night. So what were you going to say, Al?
No, I was going to say, you mentioned Robert Schimmel. I know you had quite a close relationship with him, and you guys had worked quite a bit together.
Yeah, I'm the oldest of 5, and I never had an older brother. My father wasn't around that much when I was a child. He eventually became him and I were very close. And my stepfather who was great, only was around for 5 years because of cancer. So I never really had a man that I could look up to as an older brother or father figure. And Schimmel became that guy to me. He took me in. He made sure I had a place to live. He took me all over the country with him and put it in his contract that if he was working somewhere, that I was the person who was going to open for him if I wanted to, and they couldn't book somebody else unless he approved it. So, Schimmel went above and beyond to really help me out a lot, a lot, a lot. So, it's like that all over. I mean, I've been very blessed to have these incredible people look out for me, and I vowed to do the same for others. The Boston comedy scene that I was in when I was in college, guys like Don Gavin or Tony V or these kind of comics, they were just brilliant, and they took me in and made me one of theirs. So I've been very, very blessed and lucky to have all that. But in return, I vowed that I would be that way for other people, and it happens a lot. A lot of people say, "Oh, the comedy business is a lot of jerks," but every business is a lot of jerks. But in comedy, we really look out for each other. Guys like Taylor Negron, who was a genius, taught me a lot about improving on stage, and go on and tell, give you stories about these guys. But Kinnison was really good to me at the store, and Mitzi ended up putting me in the Errol Flynn house right behind the Comedy Store. So I lived at the Comedy Store. It was my living room. So every night I was either on stage there or watching the greatest comics in the world, like a classroom. There was Roseanne and Richard Pryor, and it just on and on and on. So saying a lot of famous names, but there were also, me, Jimmy Schubert, Stephen Pearl. We were all sort of, Kinnison's younger brothers, and Kinnison took care of us and gave us stage time, and was also very honest with us, which is what you really need as a comic. You need someone to, not be mean, but to be really honest.
Not to interrupt real quick, Eddie, but as a a young comic myself coming up in Boston, some of the names that you were mentioning, like Tony V and all those guys, Jimmy Tingle, some of the
Yeah.
bunch of like the Boston guys. It's really interesting because as a young comic, those guys are still around. I still see them and I'm still very involved. So it's very cool to see that your career, and of course you mentioned the Boston Comedy Club, which I know as an enormous fan of guys like Patrice and Bill Burr and things of that nature. They came up in that room. It's very, very cool. So I just want to personally say that it's very, very cool to hear your history and to hear the great impact that you've made on this business.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Barry Crimmins was really running the Boston comedy scene, and had this really great club in Inman Square in Cambridge,
Hmm.
and he took care of us, and
The
he
Ding
actually,
Ho.
the Ding Ho, and we
Hmm.
worked there, and it was great. Jimmy Tingle was the bartender, and Don Gavin, even though he was a veteran, I worked with him at Stitches in Boston, and after the show, he spent time with me because he liked my comedy and wanted to give me some hints if I wanted it, and I took it all. And one of the best comics in the country is Tony V. Not only is he a great, amazing person, but he's a real giver, and he really looked out for everybody, including myself. And now, all these years later, there's this great hierarchy of the great Don Gavin and Lenny Clark and Steve Sweeney and all them. But Tony V is the one who I think is has risen above everybody else because he constantly writes new material. He constantly helps other people. And I look at him as a major influence in my life and my career.
Hmm.
So, Eddie, I'm sorry, you went
yeah,
to Emerson, and
hey,
was the purpose of going to Emerson to be a comedian, or did you decide at Emerson that stand-up comedy was for you?
I went to school for, radio and television. I was going to either be a DJ or a sports announcer or a news person, something like that. I had written for the local newspaper in high school, and I thought that was kind of cool. And my stepfather had died very young, so I decided I was going to really live a life where I could do the things I wanted to do. I was a math person, and would have gone to a major math program otherwise. Oddly enough, comedy is so involved. Mathematics are involved in comedy and music,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and so all of the odd specialized math that I learned through my life has helped me to be a better performer, comedian, nonverbal performer as well. So I went to Emerson, and the very beginning of Emerson, I had met all these people we became friends, and we formed a comedy group. And then it was all of a sudden wildly successful. and Dennis Leary and Stephen Wright and Mario Cantone and Laura Keitlinger, and I can the list of names. Lauren Dombrowski, who was like eventually the head writer of Fridays. All these people I went to school with, and we didn't know any better. We just did what we loved, and we worked hard at it. And it was, again, Emerson. Before us, there was Jay Leno went there, and Norman Lear, and Henry Winkler, and Andrea Martin, but there was no comedy program. So my second year at Emerson, I met Norman Lear, and I talked to him about what we were doing and how we could use some help, because we had alumni who were just great and we wanted to learn from them, including at the time, Saturday Night Live. I started school in 76. Saturday Night Live started in 75. The head writer at SNL was Marilyn Suzanne Miller, who was an Emerson graduate. So we just wanted to meet all of, Jerry Paris, the Dick Van Dyke Show and all these people. So we got to, Norman Lear came through and put money up after our discussion, and the school matched, and we formed the first comedy writing department in the country. And then it's been going on all these years, and now you can study comedy at Emerson. And then you've gotten Bill Burr and Jen Kirkman and Jennifer Coolidge, and I think the list of names is impressive, of people who have gone to Emerson because of what we started back in the day.
Mm-hmm. So when did you realize, Eddie, you've had a great career and it's been totally comedy. When did you realize that you would never have to work another day job in your life?
It's interesting because there are sort of day jobby kind of things I've done, like working at Letterman during the day.
But that's comedy related though, right?
Yeah, it's always, yeah. I never thought of it like that. I just thought of it, I just love working. I'm a workaholic. I always have been. My whole family's like that. To be honest, we were very poor in Florida, especially when my stepfather got sick. And, we needed help, and we had neighbors that helped us. We had a next door neighbor who was, our Thanksgiving dinners were provided by their church. And, we got food stamps, which was a bridge to, until my younger brothers can start working. My mother and I worked a lot. So, we appreciated everything we had, and we worked really hard, and I've never stopped. Everybody in my family, my brothers who are still around, everyone worked hard. So it never was a chore to work hard. And I loved what I did. So I don't think of it. I think of it all like during the day, I do some writing. I woke up at 3 a.m. and I couldn't go back to sleep. And I wrote a story and put it on Facebook today about an amazing story that had to do with Franco Harris.
Yeah, I was going to get to the Hungarian photographer, right?
Right.
And yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
But I'm just saying, I can't stop. You know what I mean? I was up at 3, I couldn't go back to bed. So I spent 2.5 hours writing a story. So it's a long way to go around to answer your question. But, I did have a day job as at an advertising agency. I did an internship at a news department, but those were jobs where you're basically lying. And, when you're a comedian, you're telling the truth, and that's how you become a really good comedian. So I preferred the truth over the lies and went with that.
Well, speaking of your stories and your writing, I've been hearing for years that you're going to write a book. So
I have
the
been.
book is written basically already. You don't have to slap it together. So what's the deal?
But you have to. I want a publisher. I'm stubborn about that, and I'm waiting to find out. And a friend of mine I spoke to yesterday is going to introduce me to a publisher right after Christmas.
Oh, great.
Who might be interested? Yeah, no, I would love it. But I just love I just love writing. I just love the process. It's because I do it often. You get better at it.
Sure.
So I've taken a lot of my older stories and rewritten them, and it has a better rhythm. Like like in comedy, you go on stage, and eventually like at the beginning, most comics act like a comedian. I acted like George Carlin because he was my hero, and my rhythms were very George Carlin, and some of my jokes were very similar. But then eventually you find out who you are, and you bring that to the stage, and you have your own rhythms. And rhythms are very important, especially nonverbal stuff that a lot of people don't realize the layers that it takes to be a great comedian.
Right. Well, one thing about you that differentiates you, I think, is that you don't care how big the crowd is. Some comedians, they see a small crowd, they bitch and moan about it. But you have a great story about performing for 2 people, a couple. You want to tell that story?
Well, yeah, the comic strip used to have a rule that if there was anybody left in the room, and you would have to go on. And one night they said there's only two people in there, but you're next. And I was like, okay. And those two people came. They took David Brenner actually taught me this. He says, whoever's there, whoever the crowd is, they came out to see you. They shouldn't be punished because it's a small crowd. You have to give them your best show. He yelled at me once because I got very close to him. He helped me. Him and Joan Rivers actually helped me with my very first Letterman spot. So again, I've just been blessed to be helped by some of the greatest people in the industry. And Brenner and I became very close. And he said to me one night, he was doing the 10 o'clock show at Caroline's, and I had the 12:30. Of course, he was sold out, and I had 17 people in the audience. And I kind of bitched to him. I said, oh, God, I wish it was a big crowd. And he yelled at me. He said, look, those people paid to see you. They deserve a show. And I ended up having one of the best shows of my life because of the beat down I got from Brenner. And I thanked him so much for it. And I've never forgotten that. So if there's two people in the audience, we had a great time. Those two people from Scottsdale, Arizona. I'll never forget them. I can still picture them.
Eddie, a lot of times when I talk to young comedians and they ask me advice about stand-up comedy, I will tell them that a lot of it, of course, is your writing and a lot of it is your stage presence and stuff. But a very important part of comedy, and comics are a lot of times a little weak in this area because we tend to get into comedy because we're a little socially awkward and this is our way of expressing ourselves. But usually socially, they're a mess. And you, I'm listening to you must be doing something right in the ability to network and talk to people and be willing to listen to advice, to have had such an incredible array of mentors in your life, from Sam Kinison to Schimmel to Dennis Leary to all the other people, Joan Rivers. I mean, it's not a lot of times where people can say, Joan Rivers helped me with
my very first Letterman appearance was about a week and a half away, and I was at the airport in Milwaukee. I just finished working the Comedy Cafe in Milwaukee, which was one of the best clubs ever. I did 2 New Year's Eves there. It was so good, and I loved the people who worked there. And I dated someone from Milwaukee, so they were very kind to let me work it a couple of times a year. And after the show was over, I went to the airport, and I was flying home from my gig, and there was Joan Rivers, who was flying home from her theater gig on the same flight. And so I went up to her. I'd met her once before for a very short moment. And I told her, it was nice to see you, and, the whole thing. And I was just honest with her. And I said, look, I just did this club, and I'm doing Letterman for the first time as a guest. And so we're on the plane. It was People's Express or People Airway. I forget the name of it. And it was only 2 seats. They were all first class seats. And they were famous for having delicious cookies. But it was I forget the name of the airline, Midwest Express. That was it. And so everyone has 2 seats. So I'm by myself, sitting next to this woman in the front. And all of a sudden during the flight, Joan Rivers comes over to the lady and says, will you switch seats with me? And so the lady said, sure. And then Joan Rivers said, all right, let me hear the set. And I went over the set with her on the plane. And she gave me great advice, especially about nonverbal communication skills and what she learned from Jack Benny and that kind of stuff. So, it was very, very beautiful, and I'll never forget her for it. As a matter of fact, years later, I was hosting this event on stage at the Saturday Night Live, 6H or whatever that's called, that studio. And I was sort of like a pre-show thing where I was talking to the crowd. And every time someone came in late, I would roast them a little bit. And it was all celebrities. The whole audience were celebrities. There was nobody but. And so it was kind of fun to be able to do that. And the crowd loved it. And I think people got up, go to the bathroom to come back because they wanted to get roasted. It just, all of a sudden, there were so many people who, and I wasn't a roast comic. I was just having fun with them, and they were having a blast. And then Joan Rivers came in a little bit later, and the crowd was like, all right, let's see what Eddie can do to Joan Rivers. And I told the crowd the story about how she helped me with my first Letterman set, and I wouldn't roast her ever. I wouldn't, and the crowd stood and gave her a standing ovation and cheered her, and she, like, a little tear came to her eye, and it was great. I mean, it's just like a dream come true. She's one of the greatest comics of all time, and I was lucky enough to have her attention. She was very good to comedians, always. She was good. Dick Cavett, who I got to know through the Johnny Carson Festival, um, has become like my uncle. We're like really like family, and he told me incredible stories about Joan Rivers. Every time he went to a new network or had a new show, Joan would always make sure she was there to help him with his early success. And so again, that's the Joan Rivers story. But as far as looking, getting people to help you, it's because everyone's a comedian.